All right, in this section 3.3, we're going to be looking at graphical descriptions of qualitative data, and in 3.4, we'll look at graphical descriptions of quantitative data. So in 3.1 and 3.2, we were introduced to the idea of a population, which is again the set of all individuals of interest. But remember, in most cases, you actually can't collect data from the entire population. It's simply impractical, could be timely, it could be expensive, it could just be impossible as well. So we're left with taking a sample, which is not all bad because remember in 3.2 there are sampling techniques that have a good chance of being very representative of the population. So in any case, you collect data from either a sample or a census, and now you have a large number of data values. What do we do with them? Well, no one looks just at a set of numbers. One thing we do is we want to organize the data into a table or graph. Now in this particular section 3.3, we'll look at making a table or graph for qualitative data. But we could do the same thing for quantitative data. Ultimately, you want to be able to use that graph to interpret the data and to describe the distribution of the data set and to explore different characteristics of data. Now in 3.4, so we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, there are 4 traits specifically that we want to look at for quantitative data. The measure of center, the measure of variation, the distribution, and if there are any outliers. So a lot of times we can kind of get the feeling for these 4 traits just from the graph. So the graph's pretty powerful, and things that we look at as far as characteristics are center, variation, distribution, and outliers. Now this mostly applies to quantitative data, but in general we see characteristics that can be gleaned from or gotten from a table or a graph. So this is just to annotate this. This is usually from quantitative. And when I say usually, we could come up with the idea of a center, distribution, outliers for qualitative data, but it's very easy to pick these 4 traits out from quantitative data. Now in 3.3 and 3.4, we'll be looking at graphs and understanding the aspects of these graphs. But we're not going to focus so much on making the graphs per se. There's technology out there to create these graphs, although it is important to understand the basics of how they're made. Moving on, in 3.3 we talk specifically about qualitative data, and remember from a previous section that qualitative data are words describing a characteristic of the individual. So it's a name, it's a label, it's a trait that's not numeric. Now potentially it could be a number, but that number doesn't actually measure anything about the individual. For example, your social security number, yes, it's a number so to speak. Your Harper ID number, it's a number. A jersey number if you play sports might be a number, but that number doesn't measure anything about you. It's just a label or a name. Okay, so qualitative data, remember, it's a word describing a trait about an individual. It's a name, a label. Okay, so qualitative data can be first organized in a frequency or relative frequency table. So a frequency table organizes collected data in a table using categories and frequencies. So here, frequency means count. A relative frequency table organizes raw data in a table using categories or classes and proportions or percentages. And so it's a proportion or percentage instead of a count. So frequency, it's a table that has the categories and the associated counts. A relative frequency table has categories and associated percentages. So the nice thing about a relative frequency table, they're useful when comparing data sets where there are different sample sizes. And so you could compare two different samples where each sample has a different sample size, or two different populations where you have one sample from population A has a different sample size than a sample from population B. So you can compare different sample sizes based on relative percentages. All right, next we'll look at an example of creating a frequency table with qualitative data.